The soft hum of Eleanor Thompson's car broke the stillness as it made its way through the narrow country roads that led to Wiltshire Hollow. Rows of ancient oak trees stood sentinel on either side, their leaves forming a golden canopy overhead. The gentle hues of the fading sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting a warm glow over the historic brick houses that defined the town's architecture. Eleanor, with her silver-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun, felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The town she had chosen for retirement was a stark contrast to the bustling streets of London where she'd spent her career as an investigative journalist, a career that had seen its share of danger, excitement and notoriety. But Wiltshire Hollow, with its serene surroundings and promise of tranquility, seemed like the perfect antidote to her previous life. As she drove further into the heart of the town, she noticed the central attraction, a mirror-like pond that seemed unusually still, reflecting the nearby houses and trees with an almost eerie clarity. A sign by the road read, "Wiltshire's Mirror." Children played at its edges, but curiously, Eleanor noticed that no one ventured too close to the water, especially as evening approached. She pulled her car over near a charming cafe with a hand-painted sign, "The Hollow Brew." Deciding to stretch her legs and grab a bite, she stepped inside, immediately enjoying the warm and inviting ambience. Soft jazz played in the background, and the smell of freshly baked pastries wafted in the air. After ordering a cup of tea and a scone, Eleanor chose a window seat that offered a view of the pond. From her vantage point, she could see the locals winding down their day, with shopkeepers beginning to close up and parents calling their children inside. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed an old black and white photograph hanging on the cafe's brick wall. It depicted a large gathering by the pond, a town event of some sort. But what drew her attention was a particular figure in the centre, a young man whose face was curiously blacked out. "Curious about the old days, are you?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see an elderly gentleman with kind eyes and a hint of mischief in his smile. It was Arthur Greenwood, the town's librarian, though she didn't know it yet. Eleanor tilted her head towards the photograph. "It's this figure here," she pointed. "Why is his face blacked out?" Arthur followed her gaze, his face momentarily clouding over. "Ah," he began, choosing his words carefully. "That's a part of history the town doesn't speak of much. Perhaps over time you'll come to learn why." Eleanor's journalist instincts tingled, sensing a mystery, but she chose not to press further. Instead, she introduced herself, sparking a conversation that would mark the beginning of her journey into the heart of Wiltshire Hollow's secrets. The next morning, Eleanor awoke to the sound of chirping birds and the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the curtains of her newly rented cottage. She stretched, appreciating the quiet serenity that Wiltshire Hollow offered, so far removed from the persistent honks and sirens of London. After a simple breakfast, she decided to explore the town further. A visit to the local library seemed an apt starting point, given her curiosity about the photograph she'd seen. The building itself was an old Victorian-era structure with stone walls covered in ivy. The heavy wooden door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing rows of bookshelves, each filled with books that bore the weight of time. Arthur Greenwood was behind the main counter, organising a pile of returned books. Recognising her from the cafe, he greeted her with a nod and a knowing smile. "Back for more stories, Miss Thompson?" Eleanor chuckled. "Call it occupational hazard. I've always had an insatiable curiosity." As she wandered through the aisles, a section titled Local History caught her eye. There she found books detailing the town's origins, prominent families, and historical landmarks. One book in particular, Wiltshire Hollow, A Pictorial Journey, drew her attention. Flipping through its pages, she found more photographs of the town's events, landmarks, and residents. Yet, the young man from the cafe photograph was conspicuously absent. As she delved deeper, Eleanor felt a presence behind her. Turning, she found a young man with sandy hair and inquisitive blue eyes. He introduced himself as Lucas Mitchell, a historian from Oxford. He mentioned he was in Wiltshire Hollow to trace his family lineage, believing he had ancestors from the town. the two struck a quick rapport. Lucas's research indicated his family had a significant presence in the town, but had moved away abruptly a few decades ago. The reasons were unclear, and Lucas hoped the library would offer some clues. While engrossed in conversation, Ivy Harris, the local teenager with a penchant for photography, entered the library. With her camera always slung around her neck, Ivy was a common sight around Wiltshire's Mirror. Eleanor had noticed her the previous evening, capturing the sunset's reflection on the pond. Ivy, familiar with Arthur, approached the counter to ask if there were any old photography books she could borrow. Noticing Eleanor and Lucas, she introduced herself and mentioned her fascination with the pond's beauty and history. Eleanor, seizing the opportunity, inquired if Ivy had ever captured the old gathering spot by the pond, the same spot from the cafe photograph. Ivy nodded enthusiastically, sharing that she'd taken several pictures, especially during dawn and dusk, when the pond was at its most picturesque. As the conversation flowed, Eleanor couldn't shake off a nagging feeling. The blacked-out face in the photograph, Lucas's mysterious family history, and Ivy's fascination with the pond seemed intertwined. She just couldn't piece together how. As the day wore on, the three of them, drawn together by their mutual interests, decided to meet at Wiltshire's Mirror the following evening. Eleanor hoped that by then she'd have more pieces to the puzzle that was slowly forming in her mind. The sun was on its descent, casting long shadows on the cobbled streets of Wiltshire Hollow. Eleanor stepped out of her cottage, taking a deep breath of the fresh evening air. She had agreed to meet Lucas and Ivy by the pond, a decision she questioned momentarily, but her desire for answers overrode her hesitation. She reached Wiltshire's Mirror, the pond shimmering in the evening light. Evie was already there, her camera ready, capturing the sun's last rays as they danced upon the water. Lucas arrived shortly after, a satchel slung over his shoulder, carrying what Eleanor guessed were old records or perhaps letters. The trio settled on a wooden bench, facing the water. Lucas broke the silence, pulling out a worn-out leather-bound journal from his satchel. "I found this in my grandmother's belongings after she passed," he began. "It's a diary, belonging to my great-grandfather, Henry Mitchell." He opened the diary to a bookmarked page, where a pressed bluebell flower lay. Eleanor could see the ink had faded in many places, but the meticulous handwriting spoke of a bygone era. Lucas read out an entry dated 1934, detailing a summer fair by the pond, much like the one in the photograph Eleanor had seen. The entry spoke fondly of friends, laughter, and a particular young woman named Clara, who had caught Henry's eye. As Lucas read on, the stories turned more personal. Henry wrote of secret rendezvous with Clara by the pond, of stolen kisses and whispered promises. But as summer waned, the entries took a more somber tone. Clara's family, the diary revealed, did not approve of their budding relationship due to a long-standing feud between the Mitchells and Clara's family, the Harringtons. Ivy, having heard bits of local legends, chimed in. The Harringtons were one of the wealthiest families in Wiltshire Hollow. They owned most of the land around here, including the area around the pond. Rumour has it they had a say in almost everything in town. Eleanor leaned in, piecing together the story. "And let me guess, the Harringtons and Mitchells had disputes over land." Lucas nodded. "Yes. The diary mentions disputes, but Henry believed love would overcome it all. However, the last few entries are unsettling." He read out the final entry where Henry wrote of a planned meeting with Clara by the pond. They hoped to reconcile their differences and perhaps elope. The diary, however, ended abruptly, with no further entries. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. "Do you think something happened during that meeting?" Before Lucas could reply, Ivy held up a photograph she'd taken a week ago. In it, the pond reflected the twilight sky, but there was a faint silhouette of two figures standing close, their features indistinct. "I thought it was just a trick of the light," Ivy whispered. "But now, I'm not so sure." The weight of the stories, the diary, and the photograph hung heavily in the air. Wiltshire's Mirror, calm on the surface, seemed to hold deep secrets beneath. As night descended, the trio made a silent pact. They would uncover the truth, no matter where it led them. The days following the evening by the pond were filled with a newfound sense of purpose for Eleanor, Lucas, and Ivy. They decided to divide their search to cover as much ground as possible. Eleanor's focus was on the public records. The local town hall, a grand old building with tall arched windows, housed birth, marriage, and death records dating back centuries. As she sifted through them, she discovered that Clara Harrington had indeed vanished from all public documents shortly after the summer of 1934. Curiously, a few months after her disappearance, a sizable portion of Harrington land was sold off, including the land surrounding the pond. Lucas delved deeper into personal records. Apart from his great-grandfather's diary, he found old letters exchanged between Henry and Clara. They spoke of love, of dreams to escape Wiltshire Hollow and its suffocating traditions, and to start anew elsewhere. One letter from Clara, dated just a week before the last diary entry, hinted at something ominous. She wrote of whispers she'd overheard, of plans to permanently end their union and of danger lurking. Her fear was palpable through her words. Ivy took a different route. She interviewed the oldest residents of Wiltshire Hollow, hoping to gather oral histories. Many were hesitant to speak of the past, but Ivy's persistent charm wore them down. An old woman named Agnes, who was a child back in 1934, recalled the scandal that had engulfed the town. Clara, she whispered, was believed to have been with child. For the Harringtons, this was a grave dishonour. While many believed Clara had run away to avoid bringing shame to her family, there were whispers that she met a more tragic fate. The trio reconvened at Eleanor's cottage one evening, pooling their findings. As they laid out the documents, photographs, and recounted testimonies, a clear but disturbing picture began to emerge. The forbidden love between Clara and Henry, combined with land disputes and a possible pregnancy, had set the stage for a tragedy. Lucas, his voice shaking, shared a final letter he'd discovered, hidden away in a secret compartment of his great-grandfather's writing desk. It was from Henry, addressed to Clara, but never sent. In it, Henry confessed his despair over their situation and his intention to confront Clara's father and brothers by the pond on the fateful night. Eleanor, her journalist instincts on high alert, postulated, "It's highly likely that the meeting went awry. Perhaps it escalated into violence, leading to consequences neither party had intended." Ivy, looking out of the window at the distant silhouette of the pond, whispered, "And perhaps those souls never found their peace, still lingering around Wiltshire's mirror." The weight of the past hung heavily in the room. The trio realised that while they were closer to the truth, there were still pieces of the puzzle missing. They needed undeniable evidence of what transpired that summer night in 1934. The question was, where would they find it? The next few days saw an unusual activity around Wiltshire's mirror. Word had spread about the trio's investigation into the long-forgotten mystery of Clara and Henry, and curious townsfolk often stopped by to watch them. Eleanor had contacted an old friend from her journalism days, Mark, who was now a marine archaeologist. With the pond holding so much significance in the story, she felt it was worth exploring its depths. Mark agreed to come down with his team to conduct an underwater search. As Mark and his team prepared their diving gear, Eleanor, Lucas, and Ivy briefed him on their findings. Mark, intrigued, agreed that there might be artifacts or evidence in the pond that could offer more insight. Lucas looked on nervously as the divers descended into Wiltshire's mirror. As minutes turned to hours, a small crowd gathered around the pond, the old and young alike sharing whispered tales and speculations. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mark emerged from the water, holding a small rusted metal box. Gently prying it open, they found a collection of faded letters bound together and a delicate silver locket containing a picture of Clara on one side and Henry on the other. The letters were written by Clara to her unborn child. In heart-wrenching detail, she spoke of her love for Henry, her dreams for their future, and her fears about the increasing pressures and threats from her family. The final letter, dated 2 days before their last planned meeting, read, "If you ever find these letters, know that whatever happened, our love was pure and true. I hope, in another time, in another life, we find the happiness that was denied to us in this one. The discovery was monumental. The town was abuzz with the revelation, and many of the older families, especially the remaining Harringtons, faced tough questions about their ancestors' roles in the tragedy. A memorial service was held by the pond, where the town collectively mourned the loss of Clara and Henry, acknowledging the dark chapter of their history. The recovered items were placed in a glass case in the town's museum, serving as a poignant reminder of a love that had once been. But for Eleanor, Lucas, and Ivy, their journey wasn't over. The letters and the locket had provided closure to some extent, but the final chapter of Clara and Henry's story remained unwritten. What had transpired on that ill-fated night? Who had been involved? And were there any witnesses still alive who could shed light on the matter? The trio knew their search for the complete truth was not over, but for now they took solace in the fact that they had given a voice to Clara and Henry, ensuring their story would never be forgotten again. The autumn leaves began to blanket Wiltshire Hollow as days grew shorter. With the recent discoveries at Wiltshire's Mirror, the town was in a reflective mood, reconciling with its past. Eleanor, while sifting through the town's newspaper archives, stumbled upon a series of articles from late 1934. There was an obituary for a man named Thomas Harrington, Clara's eldest brother, who had died under mysterious circumstances. This was dated just weeks after the supposed confrontation at the pond. Lucas, drawing from family anecdotes, remembered whispers of a confrontation between his great-grandfather, Henry, and the Harringtons. Piecing together the puzzle, the trio surmised that the meeting had turned violent, possibly resulting in Thomas Harrington's death. Delving further, Ivy recounted her conversation with Agnes, the elderly lady, who had mentioned a groundskeeper named Elias, who had worked for the Harringtons during that era. Rumour had it he had witnessed something on the fateful night but had disappeared shortly after. The trio decided to track down any remaining descendants of Elias. Their search led them to a neighbouring town where they met Grace, Elias's granddaughter. She remembered her grandfather as a man of few words, haunted by memories of a night he seldom spoke of. Before his death, he had confided in Grace, handing her a letter to be read after he was gone. Grace handed the letter to Eleanor. Elias had written about the night he saw 4 figures by the pond: Clara, Henry, and 2 of the Harrington brothers. He had watched from afar as a heated argument ensued, leading to a physical altercation. In the struggle, Thomas Harrington had fallen, hitting his head on a sharp rock. Panicking, the other brother, in a fit of rage and wrongly blaming Clara and Henry, took matters into his own hands. Elias, paralysed by fear, had retreated into the shadows, the weight of his silence burdening him for the rest of his life. The letter provided the closure that had eluded Wiltshire Hollow for nearly a century. The town held a second memorial service, this time for Clara, Henry, and Thomas, acknowledging the tragic chain of events that had befallen them. In the months that followed, Wiltshire's Mirror became a symbol of reflection, not just of the serene skies it mirrored, but of the town's history. A plaque was erected detailing the love story of Clara and Henry, their tragic end, and the lessons the town had learned from it. Eleanor, having penned an in-depth article about the entire investigation, saw it published in a national daily, bringing attention to the small town and its journey in confronting its past. Lucas, with the truth of his family's history finally unveiled, decided to settle in Wiltshire Hollow, becoming its unofficial historian, ensuring no other tales were lost to time. Ivy, inspired by the events, held a photo exhibition showcasing the town's history, juxtaposing old photographs with her contemporary captures, celebrating both the shadows and lights of Wiltshire Hollow. As winter approached, the trio often found themselves by the pond, their reflections mingling with those of Clara and Henry. In the pursuit of truth, they had not only uncovered a story of tragic love, but had also found friendship, purpose, and a deeper connection to the world around them.